Hi and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to show you how to do this cloudy sky with these autumn colored hills and mountains. Let's get started. So here are our colors. This is Payne's Gray mixed with a little bit of Quin Rose. This is Ultramarine Blue with Payne's Gray, Raw Sienna with Payne's Gray, Plain Raw Sienna, and New Gamboge. After thoroughly wetting my sky, I add in that blue mixture. And then I add raw sienna on the left side. Okay, I'm adding in some New Gamboge and mopping up some water that is on the bottom of the skyline, just so that it's not pooling up. I'm adding in that mixture of ultramarine blue, some Payne's Gray with a touch of Quin Rose, and I'm tilting the board a little to let gravity do the work. I'm adding in some raw sienna. And some of that mixture of raw sienna and Payne's Gray. And dropping in just a bit of that gamboge at the bottom. Mixing up a little stronger mixture of that Payne's Gray and raw sienna. Sweeping it across the sky, adding on to my other layers. Dabbing out a few places with a clean paper towel to make or to suggest a bit of clouds peeking through. You don't want to do this too much. It starts to look unnatural and you want to let the paint do what it's supposed to do, which is create those shapes for you. Okay, I'm going to re-wet the sky now, which, can be a faux pas for some watercolor artists, but I think it's fine as long as it's completely dried. It's a good way to add on some bolder colors for a more dramatic sky. If you're doing, a much lighter, paler sky contrasted with your foreground, then you probably won't need to do a second sky layer. But I like to do it when I'm trying to get that very dramatic, stormy effect. And just adding in some more raw sienna now at the bottom, suggesting some hills maybe in the background. I definitely wanted more of that brighter yellow gamboge. And I'm really just building up my layers here that are already in the initial wash. Kind of stippling on that gray mixture. And now it's drying, as you can tell on the left, so I'm working quickly, adding in some more stronger paint. Building up that ultramarine and Payne's Gray mixture on the right. And remember that as your clouds, get closer to the horizon, they are thinner, they are slimmer or smaller for sure. So be mindful of that when you're dropping in paint. Sometimes it's easy to forget, and I've done it before too. Just sweeping away some paint with my clean brush, just to get those little cloud shapes back again. Dropping in the teensiest amount of cerulean blue you might be able to notice there, just to suggest that there is a brighter sky back there. I notice my sky is about to dry again, so just taking the opportunity to add in more concentrated paint to give that bolder color that will last once the paint dries. Adding in just a few wisps of that Payne's Gray and Raw Sienna. Okay, now for the foreground colors. I'm using Hansa Yellow with Payne's Gray, Sepia, Burnt Sienna mixed with Sepia, Burnt Sienna on its own, and of course, Raw Sienna. Okay, I have wetted the foreground thoroughly, and now I am doing that whole mixture of Hansa Yellow and Payne's Gray all over the page. This will ensure that the first base layer will be very light when it dries, and it'll give that natural essence of light on the hills when I paint over and add layers. I start by dropping in some thicker mixture of that same Hansa Yellow and Payne's Gray, just to suggest some shadows while the paint and the bottom is fairly wet. So I'm still working wet and wet, and so I know I have a limited time to drop in some of these colors. But the paper has a fair shine to it, so we definitely don't have to rush this step. This is all sped up just for the ability to make a shorter video, but in reality, I took my time working through this. I'm dropping in touches of burnt sienna. It's a lovely earthy color that will go well with the first wash of these hills. Just sweeping some more of that burnt sienna and sepia mixture, especially in the hills in the back. Just sweeping it across. I'm not too worried about what this will look like, just because I know all of this, again, will dry back so much lighter. And we still have plenty of light spaces in our hills. I'm carving out a curve in the front where I know I'm going to put in a road path. All of my brush strokes are meeting towards that central spot. And so I'm doing longer, confident, sweeping motions. Taking the time to add in a few more of those earth tones wherever I can before I let my paper dry completely. Okay, my paper is completely dry, so I am now adding and building upon that first layer. Adding a mixture of raw sienna, a little bit of sepia, and then a little bit stronger sepia at the top of that first hill to suggest some shadows coming in from the left side. Blending it out and adding just a touch of green. keeping the very distant mountain mostly pale, just a slight bit of detail, but nothing crazy. We want most of our detail to be closer to the foreground. Dabbing out a little bit there because it was stronger than I would have liked. Paper towel will always be your best friend, so make sure you have just a bit of clean paper towel with you at all times. Starting off with some raw sienna and sepia for that cliff in the back. Sweeping with a bit of drier brush strokes at the top to suggest some texture and rocks. Stipling my number 4 brush, make just a few marks to add to that texture. I'm making the next layer of cliff a little less warm, so more sepia, and just a touch of Payne's gray is in that. Again, adding the more concentrated paint, stipling it at the top, make it more realistic and give it dimension. And making the color paler as I get to the bottom of that cliff and blending it out. Dropping in some brighter green for the next hill, and adding some more concentrated sepia for the bottom of that cliff to suggest elevation and giving it more texture. Adding in some finer details just to make sure my lines are a bit crisp. You'll notice that a lot of this painting is adding in detail wherever it seems necessary. Sometimes I will move on to another part of the painting and then something catches my eye and I'm like, oh no, hold on, let me add that really quickly and then proceed. It's not what everyone does. I think, sometimes a good rule of thumb is to actually paint all your lighter areas first and then add in the finer details. And you can do that. It's probably smoother and smarter, probably more efficient to paint that way. I just, when I think of a detail, I want to put it down before I forget. But that's just my process. I'm using some vertical dry brush as well as horizontal dry brush to add in some texture on the last cliff on the right, using raw sienna and a pale mix of sepia. I wasn't entirely sure what I was going to go for here, but I ended up enjoying the process, blending in that raw sienna first to create that base layer. I absolutely love using that dry brush technique. It saves so much time and gives a much more natural look than trying to stipple in every detail yourself. By the way, my paper is Saunders Waterford. I have neglected to mention that earlier, I think. And it's cold pressed on a 10 by 14 block. Okay, here I am using my rigger to carve out my path. Very thin strokes in the back and making the detail and the path a bit wider and bolder as I come into the bottom of the page. My rigger brush is most useful for this process. Those long bristles make it very much easier to make thin, confident lines. And I kept that path pretty pale because I'm going to use the surrounding hills and the stronger paints in those hills to really bring out that path. That might have sounded a bit confusing, but you'll see what I mean. Okay, I'm building up my hills with that lighter green mixture. In retrospect, I might have opted for a bigger brush at this point, but I was so committed to my number 4 Kolinsky Sable that is what I kept using. I felt some of the hills in the back needed some more shadows, so just blending in that green all the way to the back. Using some dry brush here to get some of those peak shadows and foliage. And being careful and making sure I am painting around that path that I carved out because I really don't want to get any paint there. Dropping in my favorite color, burnt sienna. Also doing the same sweeping, stipling motions. Adding in some of that sepia and Payne's gray, very light mixture of sepia and Payne's gray along the green, creating some more shadows and texture. I'm using that sepia to carve out the top of the hills or mountains. And again, it's really doing the work for me. If I do short and confident little swipes here and there, it's pretty convincing. I'm mixing up raw sienna, burnt sienna, and sepia pretty much all along these foreground mountains and hills. That way there's that suggestion of changing colors and giving it that autumn glow to it. Now for the right side of that path, I'm using a little bit of raw sienna, a little bit of that same green mixed with Hansa yellow and Payne's gray. Keeping that fairly bright, not adding too much color. Adding in sepia to suggest changes in elevation and additional hills in the front. And I'm kind of dancing my paintbrush around, stipling it, using different textures as I get closer to the bottom of the paper. Sometimes it's fun to let shapes declare themselves, and being a little spontaneous never hurts, as long as we remember the golden rule of adding in more concentrated paint if the paper is drying, never adding more water than there is on the paper, else we get those dreaded runbacks. Although I will say my paper is fairly dry, the paint that I'm adding isn't too runny, so there's a lot I can do there. And I'm minimizing the amount of errors that I can create right now. And again, I'm just using those same colors that I showed you earlier, mixing and matching, adding them in, dropping them where it feels right. I did use a reference photo from, I think, Pixabay earlier as I was planning out this painting, and there was a lot going on in that picture. So at a certain point, I took a few of those hills and placed them where it made sense, made sure the path was my focal point, but the rest of it was more intuitive. And, you know, as I'm painting down this right side, I'm looking at where certain colors would be more complementary, where a suggestion of changing elevation would be appropriate or attractive. Actually, everything's appropriate in painting, but you know, I'm looking at what's pleasing to the eye, and I am just dropping paint in accordingly. As I get close to the bottom of the paper, I'm making sure that my foreground is warmer, and so I'm dropping in raw sienna, being pretty playful with it, not, you know, creating distinct shapes, but just foliage and greenery. Burnt sienna also just at the left of that path and at the top right there. It's a bit bold, but easy to blend out. Adding in sepia, stipling it on again. Are you starting to see the benefit of that first pale green wash that we did? It's so fun to do this sort of negative painting and making sure that light is still shining through. And that's really the beauty of watercolor painting and what makes it so unique, right? We're preserving the light of our paper, and that's it. We can't add white. You know, you can use a little bit of white gouache to add very, very minute details, but you can't get the light of the paper back like this. Adding in more of those colors now on the left side, being mindful of that sort of slope that I've created in the mountains and hills above, and making sure that my strokes are sloped and going upwards. Again, utilizing dry brush while blending other colors in. And as you can see, I had switched to my bigger brush. This is a size 10 Kolinsky sable, and it's doing exactly what I needed to do. It's doing broader strokes, but it's pointed enough where I can do those fine details that I did with my number 4 brush. Dropping in some of that less concentrated paint here. Building up that burnt sienna, giving it more of a slope. I felt the painting could use another hill over there, and so easily enough you can do a light wash, add just a few strokes for suggestions of texture, and I'm going to leave that alone. I am darkening up that hill in the background. It was just a bit too pale for me. I always, one of the things that you definitely practice and learn with practice is that paints dry back so much lighter than you might think. I dropped in a little bit of raw sienna on the top of that hill, just for variation. Another great tip that took me a long time to learn is adding variation within paints, within objects. Almost anything is so nice and effective and creates that intrigue that we really want in paintings. I'm adding in a little bit of Hansa yellow in certain places to make these hills warmer. They were looking a bit too cool for my liking. So I'm really just adding a light wash of Hansa yellow to glaze around certain areas. And again, still protecting that first light layer in certain places. Just lightly warming up those areas as well. It might be looking a bit too bright on camera, but I promise these bits of yellow are not as intense as they seem. I am dabbing them out very lightly just in case that they don't dry back as light as I'm predicting, but I know they will. Just adding some more warmth, and now I'm doing a light mixture of Payne's Gray and Sepia, very light, just to add some more depth. Doing that same kind of stipling motion on that cliff, just to make it stand out a bit more. Remember what I said about paint drying back a little too light? Just a few fine details. I don't want to mess with that area too much. It is already standing out quite a lot. Adding in some light brown there. That cliff just needed a little more of that sepia, a little more texture to really define it as a cliff. And again, I'm just warming up some of the areas, defining some of the tops of other areas. Now is the time really when I'm close to the end and I'm reflecting on what else needs to be emphasized. It's one of my favorite parts of a painting, when I can look back and maybe reposition the painting or move farther away and figure out, what can I add to make this more dramatic, more interesting, and really make it pop and stand out as a painting. I think I identified here that some of the browns and shadows and shades were just not quite enough, and so I am coming in with a more concentrated pigment, really emphasizing the tops of those hills and peaks. It's really this part of the painting where I feel like your work comes alive. You're using your judgment as an artist, or even as a beginner, or an enthusiast, or a lifelong practitioner, but you're using your judgment, right? And that's your unique perspective on what will, make this painting mine, and how does my eye see the few details and enhancements. And I just think it's lovely. Okay, so I placed this paper towel, and you can't quite see it, but I am using this paintbrush, tapping it against my hand to create some very small dots along the paper, and they're not quite big enough or noticeable yet, so I will switch to a bigger paintbrush. And there we go. Now I've got some nice dots of burnt sienna, kind of suggesting a little bit of rocks, and again, the paint did the work for me, and I didn't have to spend too much time on that. Adding in a bit more paint on that distant hill, making it darker, kind of matching that stormier sky that I have up there. It's also very important to be mindful of how you've painted your sky and where the shadows and clouds are, because it has to be reflected in your foreground as well. Okay, just a few more touches here and there. And it is just about time to stop. And that's the finished painting. Well, I hope you enjoyed watching this as much as I enjoyed painting, and please leave comments and questions down below. I hope you have a good time painting, and I'll see you in the next video.